In the early years of the 20th century, Europe stood at the height of its power. Majestic empires stretched across continents, ruling over millions, their flags fluttering proudly from Africa to Asia. The great capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, thrived as centers of culture, commerce, and technology. The world appeared confident, modern, and unstoppable. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay dangerous rivalries, hidden insecurities, and the seeds of a catastrophe unlike any the world had ever seen. This was the world before the Great War. In 1914, Europe was dominated by 5 great powers: the British Empire, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Together, they balanced one another in an uneasy dance of diplomacy and rivalry. Britain commanded the seas with the world's largest navy and ruled the greatest empire in history. France remained proud but still carried the scars of its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, was ambitious, restless, and eager for recognition. Austria-Hungary was a patchwork of ethnic groups, fragile and struggling to hold together. And Russia, vast, powerful, yet deeply unstable, watched Europe with suspicion while grappling with its own internal divisions. Across these empires, nationalism was rising. Nations sought glory, independence, and power. Industrialization had transformed warfare, giving armies deadly new technologies. Colonies were seized, militaries expanded, alliances forged. The great powers believed they were protecting themselves. In truth, they were building a world set on a collision course. By 1914, Europe was divided into 2 opposing camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Britain. Each promised to defend the other, believing this network of treaties would preserve peace. Instead, it created a deadly chain reaction. If one nation fell into war, its allies would follow. The entire continent was now linked together like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Peace was fragile and militarism fed its weakness. Governments poured resources into weapons and armies, boasting of their strength. Germany built a navy to rival Britain's, sparking an arms race across the seas. France extended military service to strengthen its forces. Russia mobilized millions determined to prove itself. Newspapers glorified generals, children played with toy soldiers, and leaders spoke confidently of war as if it were an honorable adventure. By 1914, Europe was armed to the teeth. Beyond Europe, imperialism added fuel to the fire. Africa had been carved up by European empires in a scramble for resources and power. In Asia, colonies were contested, trade routes were fought over, and new markets were seized. Germany, late to the race for empire, felt cheated of its place in the sun. France resented German control of Alsace-Lorraine, a territory lost in 1871. Britain sought to contain German ambition, wary of any rival that threatened its global dominance. Each empire carried grudges, ambitions, and jealousies into 1914. Nowhere was nationalism more explosive than in the Balkans. This was Europe's tinderbox, a region of competing identities and collapsing empires. Austria-Hungary ruled over Slavic peoples who longed for independence. Serbia, a small but proud kingdom, dreamed of uniting all Slavs under its banner. Russia saw itself as protector of these Slavs, ready to challenge Austria-Hungary's authority. The Ottoman Empire, once powerful, was in decline, leaving power vacuums and conflicts in its wake. In this tense and volatile region, it was only a matter of time before sparks would fly. The spark came on June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. To many Serbs, Bosnia was not Austria's to rule. In the streets, a secret group of Serbian nationalists, the Black Hand, plotted his assassination. That morning, gunmen waited. After one failed attempt, fate offered them another chance. As the Archduke's car took a wrong turn, Gavrilo Princip stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired. 2 shots rang out. Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, lay dead. The assassination shocked the world. In Vienna, anger demanded revenge on Serbia. In Belgrade, fear spread of Austrian invasion. Across Europe, leaders debated how to respond. None realized that this single act of violence would ignite a war stretching from Europe to Africa, from Asia to the seas, claiming millions of lives. The fuse had been lit. In the weeks that followed, Europe spiraled toward disaster. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding impossible concessions. Backed by Germany's blank check of support, Austria prepared for war. Serbia accepted most demands, but it was not enough. On July 28, Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend its ally. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. To strike France quickly, German armies marched through Belgium, bringing Britain into the war. Within a matter of days, the alliance system had turned a regional conflict into a global catastrophe. The Great War had begun. In August 1914, millions cheered their armies as they marched off to war. In Berlin, crowds waved flags and sang patriotic songs. In Paris, soldiers kissed loved ones goodbye, convinced they would return by Christmas. In London, volunteers lined up to enlist, eager for glory. Across Europe, the mood was one of confidence, excitement, and pride. Few understood the true horror that awaited them. Machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, poison gas, and endless trenches would transform this war into a nightmare. Europe stood on the brink of destruction, its people marching willingly into a storm from which there would be no easy escape. The assassination in Sarajevo had set the world ablaze. Within weeks, nations mobilized, alliances activated, and empires prepared for total war. What began as a Balkan crisis had become a global conflict. The world before the war was gone, replaced by uncertainty, fear, and fire. In Part 2, we witnessed the outbreak of war, the battles that followed, and the grim reality of life in the trenches. As the war began, Germany put into motion its grand strategy, the Schlieffen Plan. Designed years earlier, it was intended to avoid a two-front war. Germany would strike France first, quickly and decisively, then turn east to face Russia, whose mobilization would take longer. To achieve this, German armies swept through neutral Belgium, aiming to outflank French defenses and capture Paris within weeks. But this bold plan ignored one crucial reality. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. The violation would draw the British Empire into the war. In August 1914, German troops advanced into Belgium. They expected little resistance. Instead, Belgian soldiers fought bravely, slowing the invaders at fortresses like Liège. The German army retaliated with brutal force, destroying villages, executing civilians, and sparking outrage across the world. The resistance bought the Allies precious time. By the time German forces pushed into France, the French and British armies were mobilized and ready to fight. France launched its own offensive, known as Plan 17. French troops in bright blue and red uniforms charged into Alsace and Lorraine, determined to reclaim the provinces lost in 1871. But they met with disaster. German firepower cut them down in staggering numbers. Meanwhile, British soldiers, the small but professional British Expeditionary Force, engaged the Germans at Mons. Though heavily outnumbered, they fought with skill, delaying the German advance. The opening battles of the war were costly and brutal, shattering illusions of a quick victory. By early September, German armies stood at the gates of Paris. The French capital prepared for evacuation. But at the River Marne, the Allies made a desperate stand. French taxis famously ferried soldiers to the front. For days the battle raged. Finally, the exhausted German advance stalled. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Paris was saved. The war that was supposed to be over in 6 weeks would drag on for 4 long years. After the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. From September to November, armies pushed northward through France and Belgium, each attempting to break through. Instead, they reached the North Sea, locked in a stalemate stretching hundreds of miles. Trench lines began to form, and the Western Front was born, a front that would barely move for the next 4 years. By winter 1914, the Western Front had solidified into trenches, deep, muddy ditches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Life in the trenches was misery. Soldiers lived among rats, lice, and mud. Shellfire thundered day and night. Machine guns mowed down anyone who dared to cross the open ground known as no man's land. Barbed wire, artillery barrages, and poison gas turned battlefields into hellscapes. The war had entered a new, horrifying phase, industrial slaughter. While the West settled into stalemate, the Eastern Front remained fluid and mobile. Here, massive armies clashed across vast distances. In August 1914, German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff crushed the Russian army at Tannenberg, encircling and destroying entire divisions. Yet Russia's sheer size and manpower meant it could continue fighting, drawing German forces east and preventing them from overwhelming France. For Austria-Hungary, however, the Eastern Front was a disaster. Its armies suffered defeat after defeat against both Russia and Serbia, exposing the empire's fragility. This was not merely a European war. The conflict quickly spread across the globe. In Africa, colonial troops fought in campaigns from German East Africa to the deserts of Namibia. In Asia, Japan, honoring its alliance with Britain, seized German colonies in China and the Pacific. Across the oceans, the world sea lanes became battlegrounds. The British Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany, cutting off supplies and threatening starvation. German U-boats prowled the seas, sinking merchant ships and declaring unrestricted submarine warfare. The First World War was truly global. The war pulled in men from every corner of the empires. Indian soldiers fought in France and Mesopotamia. Australians and New Zealanders, Anzacs, joined campaigns in the Middle East. Africans, Canadians, and Caribbean soldiers fought under European banners. For many, this was their first experience of Europe's wars, and their sacrifices would reshape the politics of empire in years to come. By Christmas 1914, the first winter of the war set in. The front lines had frozen into stalemate. Yet, in a moment of humanity amidst the horror, something extraordinary happened. Along parts of the Western Front, German and Allied soldiers called a temporary truce. They exchanged gifts, sang carols, and even played football in no man's land. The Christmas truce showed that even in the darkest war, the spirit of peace and brotherhood endured. But it was brief. Soon the guns roared again and the killing resumed. By the end of 1914, the world was locked in total war. Millions had fought, hundreds of thousands had died, and there was no end in sight. The Western Front lay in deadlock. The Eastern Front raged on. The empires of the world were now fully engaged in a conflict that would reshape history. In Part 3 we will witness the war's escalation, new weapons, devastating offensives, and the battles that defined the Great War's terrible legacy. The year 1915 marked the war's transformation from short campaigns to prolonged attrition. Both sides dug in deeper, seeking breakthroughs that never came. Leaders clung to the idea of decisive battles, yet the new technologies of war, machine guns, heavy artillery, barbed wire, favored defense. The Western Front became a graveyard of strategies, where millions of soldiers would die for only yards of ground. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, Germany unleashed a terrifying new weapon, chlorine gas. Carried by the wind, the green cloud rolled over Allied trenches, searing lungs, blinding eyes, and suffocating men. Thousands fell in minutes. Gas masked the battlefields with horror, forcing soldiers to fight with respirators strapped to their faces. Though unpredictable and often ineffective, gas became a symbol of the war's cruelty, an invisible terror that haunted soldiers until the very end. Meanwhile, the Allies sought another path to victory, the Gallipoli Campaign. In 1915, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, proposed a daring plan. By seizing the Dardanelles Strait, the Allies could open supply lines to Russia and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. In April, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Gallipoli. Among them were soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, who carved their legend in blood on the cliffs of the peninsula. But the Ottomans, led by commanders like Mustafa Kemal, fought fiercely. Months of stalemate, disease, and terrible losses followed. By the end of 1915, the Allies withdrew, defeated. Gallipoli became a symbol of courage and sacrifice, but also of strategic failure. On the Eastern Front, 1915 saw dramatic shifts. Germany and Austria launched massive offensives against Russia, pushing deep into Poland and the Baltic. Entire Russian armies were captured. Refugees fled by the millions, leaving villages in ruin. The Tsar's forces reeled from defeats, undermining confidence in the Russian monarchy. The empire's weaknesses were laid bare, setting the stage for revolution. In May 1915, Italy entered the war on the side of the Allies, abandoning its alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Enticed by promises of territory, Italy opened a new front against Austria along the Alps. The battles were brutal, fought on cliffs, glaciers, and mountainsides. Soldiers endured avalanches, frostbite, and artillery barrages in one of the most grueling theaters of the war. Though Italy hoped for swift victories, the Alpine front soon became yet another bloody stalemate. At sea, the struggle grew fiercer. Germany's U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships supplying Britain. In May 1915, one such submarine torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, a passenger liner, killing nearly 1,200 people, including Americans. The sinking sparked outrage and began to turn American opinion against Germany. Naval warfare was changing. Blockades, submarines, and convoy systems would shape the struggle for control of the seas. In 1916, Germany sought to break France's spirit through a war of attrition. The target, Verdun, a fortress city with immense symbolic value. In February, German guns unleashed one of the largest barrages in history. Villages were reduced to rubble, landscapes turned to moonscapes. For 10 months the battle raged. The French, under General Philippe Pétain, vowed, "They shall not pass." Verdun became a furnace, consuming soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. By year's end, French and German casualties each neared 400,000. The city had not fallen, but the cost was beyond comprehension. To relieve pressure on Verdun, the Allies launched a massive offensive on the River Somme in July 1916. The first day remains the bloodiest in British history, nearly 60,000 casualties with 20,000 dead. Soldiers advanced into machine gun fire, tangled in barbed wire, obliterated by shell fire. Over 5 months, the Somme offensive gained only a few miles at the cost of over 1 million lives. Yet amidst the horror, a new weapon appeared on the battlefield, the tank. Though primitive and unreliable, tanks hinted at the mechanized future of war. Meanwhile, Russia launched one of its most successful offensives of the war. In June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov struck against Austria-Hungary in a brilliantly planned attack. Using surprise tactics and concentrated artillery fire, Russian forces shattered Austrian lines. Entire Austro-Hungarian armies collapsed. Though Russia lacked the resources to fully exploit the breakthrough, the offensive weakened Austria irreparably, forcing Germany to divert reinforcements east. Once again, the balance of the war shifted. By 1916, the skies above the battlefield became a new arena of combat. Fragile biplanes fought duels in the clouds, their pilots hailed as knights of the air. Names like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, became legendary. Though aerial combat was romanticized, the reality was deadly. Pilots faced freezing winds, mechanical failures, and life expectancy measured in weeks. Airplanes also brought new dangers. Reconnaissance-guided artillery and bombers struck cities far from the front. The war had expanded into the third dimension. By the end of 1916, the war had consumed millions of lives. Verdun and the Somme symbolized industrial slaughter without victory. Empires strained under the weight of endless casualties, hunger, and despair. New weapons and new fronts widened the conflict, but the end remained out of sight. The world was locked in a war of exhaustion. In Part 4 we will see the turning points: revolution in Russia, America's entry into the war, and the global struggles that would reshape the century. By the dawn of 1917, the war had dragged on for nearly 3 years. Millions were dead, entire landscapes reduced to ruin, and the empires of Europe strained to breaking. Yet still, no side had achieved victory. Something had to give. That year would prove decisive, reshaping not only the course of the war but the future of the world itself. Germany, desperate to choke Britain into submission, made a bold and dangerous gamble. In early 1917, it declared the return of unrestricted submarine warfare. Every ship, merchant, passenger, or military, would be considered a target. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking vessels at a terrifying pace. Britain's survival hung by a thread. Yet this strategy also carried immense risk, for it threatened to bring new enemies into the war. The United States had remained neutral since 1914, though public opinion leaned toward the Allies. But as German U-boats sank American ships, anger grew. Then came the infamous Zimmermann telegram, an intercepted message in which Germany urged Mexico to join the war against the U.S. in exchange for lost territories. Outraged, the American people rallied to war. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declared that America would enter the conflict, vowing to make the world safe for democracy. The entry of the United States transformed the war from a European struggle into a truly global clash of powers. While America entered the war, Russia was collapsing. Years of defeats, hunger, and hardship had shattered the Tsarist regime. In March 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers mutinied, workers struck, and the centuries-old Romanov dynasty fell. A provisional government took power, promising reform but vowing to continue the war. Yet the Russian people, exhausted and desperate, demanded peace. Later that year, in November, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control in the October Revolution. They promised land, bread, and peace, and they delivered. Russia withdrew from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. For the Allies, this was a disaster. For Germany, it was a chance. Now they could focus on the Western Front. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Allies sought to break the stalemate with bold offensives. In spring 1917, French commander Robert Nivelle promised a decisive breakthrough. His plan was ambitious, too ambitious. When the offensive began, French troops were slaughtered by machine guns and artillery. The promised victory never came. Instead, casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Morale collapsed. Entire French units mutinied, refusing to launch suicidal attacks. The French army, once proud and determined, teetered on the brink of collapse. It would take new leadership under General Philippe Pétain to restore discipline, by improving conditions and limiting reckless assaults. In the summer of 1917, the Allies launched another offensive, this time at Passchendaele in Belgium. 4 months, artillery pounded the land until it became a swamp of mud. Soldiers drowned in shell holes filled with rainwater. Horses and men alike sank into the quagmire. Despite unimaginable suffering, the offensive dragged on. The Allies gained only a few miles at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Passchendaele became a byword for futility, its name forever linked with mud, misery, and death. While the Western Front stagnated, the war in the Middle East unfolded differently. British forces, aided by Arab fighters under the leadership of figures like Lawrence of Arabia, fought against the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, the British captured Jerusalem, marking a turning point in the campaign. The Arab revolt spread across the deserts, striking railways and Ottoman garrisons. The war in the Middle East was not just about empires, it was about shaping the future of the region, with consequences still felt a century later. In late 1917, the Italian front erupted in crisis. At Caporetto, German and Austrian forces launched a devastating offensive. Using infiltration tactics, stormtroopers slipped past Italian defenses, sowing chaos. Entire divisions collapsed. The Italian army retreated in disarray, losing hundreds of thousands of men and vast swaths of territory. The disaster forced the Allies to rush reinforcements to stabilize the front. Caporetto became a symbol of military disaster, and a painful scar for Italy. By 1917, the war in the skies had intensified. Fighter aces like the Red Baron became household names, but aerial combat was more deadly than glamorous. New bombers carried destruction to cities far behind the front lines, bringing civilians into the war's shadow. At sea, the German U-boat campaign threatened Britain's survival, but the introduction of the convoy system, groups of ships protected by destroyers, helped reduce losses. Technology and adaptation shaped every front of the conflict. By the end of 1917, the war had entered a new phase. Russia was gone, America was in, and the old order of Europe was crumbling. The cost in blood and suffering was unimaginable, yet the final outcome remained uncertain. The coming year, 1918, would bring decisive offensives, revolutions, and the war's ultimate conclusion. But it would also bring the greatest struggles of all. The year 1917 was a turning point in the First World War. Revolutions toppled empires, new powers rose, and millions more lives were sacrificed. The war that began as a European struggle was now a global confrontation, with the future of nations and empires hanging in the balance. In Part 5, we will witness the final year, the German spring offensives, America's arrival in force, and the armistice that ended the war to end all wars. As 1918 began, Germany stood at a crossroads. Russia had exited the war, freeing up nearly 1 million German soldiers for the Western Front. For the first time since 1914, Germany had a chance to win. Yet time was running out. The British blockade starved the empire, morale at home faltered, and America was mobilizing. German leaders knew their only hope was a decisive victory before U.S. forces could arrive in full strength. Thus began the Great Gamble, the Spring Offensives. In March 1918, Germany struck with overwhelming force. Using stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units trained to bypass strong points, German troops surged across the Western Front. The Allies reeled as German forces advanced farther than they had in years. For weeks, panic gripped Paris. The German army came within artillery range of the city. Yet the offensives carried a fatal flaw. There was no clear objective beyond breakthrough. Supplies lagged, soldiers exhausted themselves, and Allied resistance stiffened. Though Germany had gained ground, it had not won the war. The strength was bleeding away. By the summer of 1918, fresh American troops arrived in Europe by the hundreds of thousands each month. Young, well-fed, and eager, they brought new energy to the exhausted Allies. At battles like Belleau Wood, American Marines earned a fierce reputation, halting German advances at terrible cost. General John J. Pershing insisted on keeping U.S. forces as an independent army rather than merging them completely into British or French units. This decision allowed the Americans to grow into a decisive force in the war's final months. In July 1918, Germany launched one final offensive at the Marne River. But this time the Allies were ready. With American troops now in strength, the German attack faltered. In August, the Allies counterattacked. At the Battle of Amiens, tanks, planes, artillery, and infantry worked together in a coordinated assault. The German lines crumbled. General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's chief strategist, called it the Black Day of the German Army. From then on, the Allies pushed relentlessly forward. From August to November 1918, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of attacks that drove the Germans back across France and Belgium. Each day, soldiers advanced, capturing trenches, villages, and strongholds. Tanks spearheaded assaults, supported by creeping barrages of artillery. Airplanes strafed and bombed retreating forces. The German army, once feared across Europe, staggered under the blows. Casualties soared. Desertions increased. At home, hunger and despair spread like wildfire. Germany was not alone in its collapse. In September 1918, Bulgaria surrendered. Soon after, the Ottoman Empire capitulated, its armies shattered in Palestine and Mesopotamia. In October, Austria-Hungary disintegrated as ethnic groups declared independence. Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and others breaking free from centuries of imperial rule. The once mighty dual monarchy ceased to exist. Surrounded, starved, and exhausted, Germany stood alone. As the Allies advanced, revolution erupted inside Germany. Strikes and protests spread through cities. In November, sailors in Kiel mutinied, refusing to sail on a suicidal mission. Workers' councils formed, demanding peace. The Kaiser's authority collapsed. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. Germany declared itself a republic as revolution swept through the empire. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. After 4 years of slaughter, the Great War was over. Soldiers emerged from their trenches into a world of silence they could hardly comprehend. The cost had been staggering. Over 16 million dead, millions more wounded, entire landscapes obliterated, empires shattered. The war had changed everything. The First World War ended, but peace was fragile. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, territorial losses, military restrictions, and crushing reparations. Many hoped it would be the war to end all wars. But beneath the surface, anger and resentment festered. New nations emerged from the wreckage of empires, yet old rivalries remained. The world entered a new century scarred by the memory of the trenches, the gas, and the unending fields of the dead. The First World War was more than a conflict. It was a turning point in human history. It ended empires, redrew maps, and transformed societies. It gave rise to new ideologies, from communism in Russia to fascism in Italy and Germany. It unleashed technologies that redefined warfare and civilian life alike. And it left a legacy of sorrow, a warning written in blood and mud, that the world would tragically forget within a generation. The year 1918 marked the end of the Great War, but also the beginning of a troubled century. The sacrifices of millions ended one conflict, only to sow the seeds of another. Yet in the silence of that November day, as the guns ceased and the smoke lifted, there was hope. Hope that humanity might learn from its suffering. Hope that peace might endure. The First World War remains a testament to courage and to tragedy, to endurance and to loss, and to the fragile dream of a better world.